Okay, I wanted to read the introduction to Intellectual Foundations of Chinese Modernity by Edmund S.K. Fung, which is a great text. Modernity, an unfinished project, as Jürgen Habermas terms it, has been a subject of considerable interest to intellectuals in the People's Republic of China since the late 1980s, with some scholars questioning the postmodernist claim that modernity is dead. In 1997, for example, the intellectual historian Xu Jilin asked rhetorically whether modernity had really come to an end. Certainly not, he said, as far as Chinese modernity is concerned. He said this in his text, 寻求意义现代化变迁与文化批判. More importantly, in the same year, a lively debate, 1997, took place between liberals or neoliberals and the so-called New Left, following the publication of the literary scholar and intellectual historian Wang Hui's provocative article, Contemporary Chinese Thought and the Question of Modernity. The article has since attracted a great deal of scholarly attention at home and abroad and has been translated into Korean, Japanese, and English. Wang Hui's Contemporary Chinese Thought and the Question of Modernity, known in Chinese as 当代中国的思想状况与现代性问题, originally published in the journal Tianya Frontiers and has been reprinted in 知识分子立场自由主义之政与中国思想界的分化, edited by Li Shitao, published in the Intellectual Mecca of Changchun in 2002. Nice 40 pages long in Chinese. That's epic. Okay.
The library will be closing in 10 minutes. If you have any materials to check out or study routines turned in, please come to the front desk immediately.
Immediately being the key operative word here. Okay, in many respects, the debate was between liberal thought, especially classical liberalism, and socialist thought in the context of Chinese transition to a global market economy and of the social and economic inequality spawned by the economic reforms. See again, Li Shitao. Okay. The debate is ongoing, which reminds us of the cultural and intellectual controversies of the pre-communist period. There are similarities. Intellectuals of the Republican era wrestled with questions of modernization, wealth and power, liberty, democracy, equality, and social justice, and contemplated China's place in the world. Contemporary intellectuals, finding themselves in an era of reform and globalization, continued the search for Chinese modernity that had begun 3/4 of a century earlier. They, too, grapple with the question of whither China, using a similar language of critical inquiry to explore issues, some of which stretch back many decades. The similarities are instructive. The intellectual foundations of Chinese modernity date back to the Republican era. This historical study is concerned with the cultural and political dimensions of Chinese modernity that are underpinned by a triad of liberal, conservative, and socialist thought during the period under review. Previous scholarship has tended to treat each component of this triad in isolation, as though the three are separate, distinct, and mutually opposed. Consequently, it has overlooked their interrelatedness and interactions, leaving many assumptions, some old and some more recent, about modern Chinese thought open to challenge. Chinese conservatism is often seen as essentially a cultural conservative, and not a political one, see Benjamin Schwartz, or as part of a post-World War I anti-modernization phenomenon in the non-West. See Kai, otherwise known as Guy S. Alito 文化受成主义论泛现代化思潮的剖析. Wow, anti-modernization book. Liberalism imported into China first through Japan and then directly from the West often is said to have been misunderstood and even distorted by Chinese intellectuals who are blamed for the damage done to the liberal cause in the Republican era. See, for example, Liu Junning, 共和民主宪政自由主义思想研究. Okay, 1998. And socialism is all too often studied in the context of the communist movement as revolutionary socialism. PRC scholars have long maintained that liberalism, which subsumes cultural radicalism, cultural conservatism, and Marxism, were the three competing currents of thought during the Republican period. In their scholarship, socialism, since 1921, is equated with Marxism, along with the thought of Mao Zedong, producing a communist-dominated historiography that obscures the reformist alternative put forward by non-Marxist, non-communist intellectuals who had a socialistic impulse. See, for example, review articles by Fu Qingmin and Yu Zuohua, 社会主义潮与马克思主义中国化. Well, okay, signification of socialism and Marxism. Essays published in Jinan. Wow, it's all about the North, Shandong, 2005. But yeah, this disregards the fact that socialist thought of a reformist kind was an important feature of modern Chinese political thought. This study seeks to offer a new frame of reference for thinking about this triad. It takes a fresh, integrated approach, treating the three entities simultaneously in an intricate relationship. Little, however, will be written about democratic thought, which I have treated elsewhere in his book Edmund S.K. Fung, In Search of Chinese Democracy, Civil Opposition in Nationalist China, 1929 to 49, Cambridge University Press, 2000. It should also be stated at the outset that socialist thought here refers not to Marxism, although Marxism itself was an ideology of modernization, but reformist socialism of a kind akin to the revisionist socialism in Western Europe. Marxism is left out not only because it's well covered elsewhere, see, for example, Arlif Dirlich, Revolution and History, Marxist History in China, Dirlich, Nick Knight, Marxist Philosophy in China, from Chu by Mao Zedong, published in Dordrecht by Springer. So it's been covered elsewhere. But I also leave out Marxism because the key figures studied here were not Marxists. They simply had non-socialist impulses. Listen up, Glenn Beck. Okay. It was not that Marxist thought was marginalized. In fact, there was great interest in it, or in dialectical materialism, between 1928 and 1935 as the defining feature of Chinese thought, to use Dirlich's phrase, not to say by the 1940s. But the intellectuals in this study were not that leftist. Although they accepted Marxism's critique of capitalism, they repudiated the notion of class struggle and social revolution. This book, therefore, proceeds from the premise that liberal, conservative, and socialist thought was all a response to the crisis of modernization, and that modern Chinese thought is marked by a plurality of competing ideas. Unraveling their complexity, interrelatedness, interactions, and dialectical relationship is the key to understanding Chinese modernity in its intellectual, cultural, and political configurations. This book seeks to illuminate the process and pathos of Chinese intellectual history in the interweaving of a variety of ideas, Chinese and Western, old and new, modern and traditional, liberal and conservative, radical and reformist, addressing broader questions and the underlying issues that cannot be analyzed by using binary explanatory categories. China has a long history of responding to the Western intrusion dating back to the latter half of the 19th century following the Opium War and other armed conflicts with foreign powers. Underscoring the response was reformist thought that evolved through several phases. The first phase was self-strengthening movement dating approximately 1860 to 1894, which was characterized by a strategy and mindset of, quote, learning from the barbarians to deal with barbarians, with its focus on the acquisition of Chinese arms, Western arms rather, and technologies. The second phase, from the aftermath of the Sino-Japanese War, 1894-95, through the new administration, the post-Boxer decade, to the end of the Qing Dynasty, 1644 to 1912, was marked by a new emphasis on institutional change. The third phase, from the founding of the Republic to the new culture movement, 1915 to 21, saw a shift in intellectual thinking to the role of culture in China's modern transformation. Other phases that followed featured culture, politics, and economics as intimately intertwined as the quest for modernity. Driven by the need to survive as a nation, China's new intellectuals sought a new level of integration into the modern world. They attempted to achieve this in three sometimes overlapping modes. The first mode was represented by cultural radicalism, which found expression in the thought of the Westernizers who took an iconoclastic attitude toward the Chinese heritage. This radical anti-traditionalism, asserts Lin Yusheng, began in the May 4th period in his book published in Madison, Wisconsin, 1979, known as The Crisis of Chinese Consciousness. Radical anti-traditionalism in the May 4th era. This radical anti-traditionalism began in the May 4th period, asserts Lin Yusheng. Although the birth of modern Chinese radicalism really started in late Qing, it culminated in the 1930s in the call by the political scientist and sociologist Chen Shujing, 1903 to 67, for, quote, total westernization. The most extreme statement of this position was made by those who idealized Western culture, society, and institutions. This first mode represents a strand of liberal thought that I call westernized radicalism in Chapter 1. The second mode, represented by cultural conservatism and linked to modern conservative thought, defended the national heritage while emphasizing cultural synthesis through a confluence of Western and Chinese ideas. The third mode, represented by the New Confucians, was a variant of the second mode, emphasizing either, quote, returning to the roots in order to be creative and new, 翻本开心, or creating something new in order to strengthen the core, 创新固本. There was a fourth mode, represented by radical Marxism, which is outside the scope of this study. This non-Marxist, non-communist elite studied here constituted a group of mainstream intellectuals who were basically social and political reformers, even though some were cultural radicals. They appropriated Western ideas, adapted them to local conditions, and used them to rethink, reevaluate, and reformulate the Chinese past and articulate visions of Chinese modernity. They lived in an age when traditional authority had been eroded, first by the abolition of the civil service examination in 1905, and then by the demise of the monarchical system. The literati of yesteryear were re-educating themselves in order to seek a leadership role in the post-imperial order. Those of a younger generation, the new intellectuals, were exposed to a range of ideologies, from liberalism to democracy to capitalism, socialism to anarchism to Marxism, about which they were keen to learn within so short a time what Brantley Womack has called compressed intellectual modernization in his article, The Phases of Chinese Modernization, in an edited volume by Steve S.K. Shin, 1979. Politically, they favored a strong state marked by national cohesion, constitutionalism, powerful government, administrative efficiency, and the rule of law. They, too, had a socialistic impulse. How different schools of thought contended, interacted, and influenced one another as they developed is the main concern of this study. A number of themes will be developed, namely cultural radicalism, cultural conservatism, reformism, nationalism, statism, state building, capitalist development, social justice, liberty, and equality. These themes are linked to the three currents of thought and to the three modes of integrating China into the modern world. In this way, this book by S.K. Fung, Edmund S.K. Fung, I'm sorry, Edmund, seeks to promote a better understanding of the intellectual foundations of Chinese modernity from the perspective of non-Marxist intellectuals. So, enjoy it. That's pages 1 through 5. Wonderful journey. High five. All right. Boom!